Booker T. Washington. You hear his name during Black History Month. Places, schools, and streets are often named after him. But who was Booker T. Washington? He was one of the most important influencers in education because he opened the door to intelligence and closed the door to ignorance for people of color. The main difference in Booker T. Washington's leadership compared to any influential figure in education was the time period in which he influenced. PBS.org published an article titled Slavery in the Making of America, and in this article, it provides a document of the Virginia 1819 Code. The Code of 1819 describes the law that educating slaves in any form was prohibited and considered unlawful. Antonio Bly published an article called Slave Literacy and Education in Virginia, and in this article he states that many slaves worked hard and often took great risks to educate themselves. Antonio then later goes on to explain Booker T. Washington and his life, and he states that he was born into slavery in 1856 and worked on a plantation with his mother for about 9 years as a slave. In Booker T. Washington's autobiography, published in 1901, titled Up from Slavery, he states that I determined from a small child that if I accomplished nothing else in life, it would be that I would find a way to obtain enough education to enable myself to read. He then states that he somehow induced his mother to secretly obtain him a book, which this was unlawful. And somehow she got him a copy of the Webster Spelling Book, which contained the alphabet. Booker T. Washington later states that he began to devour this book. History.com published a page about Booker T. Washington, and it states that in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation declared that slaves were now and forever shall be free. Britannia.com published a biography titled Booker T. Washington, and it states that soon after the Emancipation Proclamation, Black individuals and institutes were now deemed worthy by white philanthropist support groups. With the help of these white philanthropist members of the free Black community quickly began opening up schools for African Americans and former slaves. But there came about a problem for most freed people. Derek Green from Prager University states in his article, Project 21, he explains that former slaves were now confused as what to do with their freedom, because the majority of former slaves were never really familiar with an education because it was considered unlawful. But what made Booker T. Washington who he was the fact that he helped so many African Americans, find and establish who they were and their capacity through the use of education. But that started with him first educating himself. History.com states that the start of the Booker T. Washington's transformation is when he was working at a coal mine and he overheard two co-workers talking about Hampton University, which Hampton University was a white philanthropist school that offered education for former slaves. The site also states that Booker T. Washington so desperately wanted this education that he literally walked 500 miles to even to go to this school. And he later graduated there 4 years later and returned to be the school's first Black teacher. Virginia Museum of History and Culture has a collection titled Civil Rights in Virginia, and it states that in 1881, Armstrong, which was the head of Hampton University, he was the principal of Hampton University, he recommended Washington to go and be a head of a new school, which was the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. In the article states that the most of Booker T. Washington's projects and schools that he was a head of, including Tuskegee University, were all funded by these wealthy white philanthropist groups. People such as included John D. Rockefeller, Anna T. Jeans, and so many more. Booker T. Washington was able to grip the attention of these white donors and make them realize that former slaves deserved an education as well. Booker T. Washington was the president of this school until his death and contributed to a lot of what the school is today. And the Constitutional Rights Foundation published an article titled Booker T. Washington, and it states that Tuskegee became a powerhouse for African American education and political influence in the United States. Through Tuskegee, Washington raised up so many leaders who later expanded on his own work. In contribution to Booker T. Washington, Tuskegee University states on their website, his impact on his students through his education became so widely known that Washington was actually invited by Theodore Roosevelt to be the first black person to dine at the White House. Lynching, anti-black groups like the KKK, threats, and racism was happening all around him. Britannia.com published a biography about Booker T. Washington, and it states that even Washington's visit to the White House was stormed with protests of people. The Constitutional Rights Foundation also states that Booker T. Washington, still in the midst of all this, spoke out about the evils against segregation, lynching, and discrimination. Booker T. Washington believed that former slaves needed to be lifted out of the pit of ignorance, and he believed what people of color lacked was knowledge and education. Tuskegee University describes on their website a monument tribute for Booker T. Washington. This monument sits at the center of their campus, and it's titled Lifting the Veil. In the inscription at its base, it reads that he, meaning Booker T. Washington, he lifted the veil of ignorance from his people and pointed the way to progress through education. Booker T. Washington lifted the veil of ignorance to people of color obtaining an education. He uncovered the lie that African Americans were undeserving of an education and pointed the way for them to strive through starting with an education. Washington showed that oppressed people could advance through this education. Imagine what today would have been like if people like Booker T. Washington didn't stand in that gap. In Booker T. Washington's autobiography, Up From Slavery, he states, "I began everything with the idea that I could succeed, and I never had much patience for the multitude of people who always had reasons why they could not succeed." His idea of his own personal succession in education was unmeasurable, which made his contribution to the field of education unstoppable.